Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. We have a very special program today to discuss the Arab Spring, the popular uprising that swept through the Middle East over the past decade. What were its roots? What are its meanings? How should we interpret it? Are we in the first 10 years of a 30-year process, maybe even a 40 or a 50-year process in a long and bitter struggle demanding a transition to better governance, end to corruption, political accountability, and respect for basic human rights? These are, of course, very big questions, but I'm pleased to say that we are joined by two very big figures to help us navigate the answers. Professor John Esposito from Georgetown University, founding director of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and the Bridge Initiative, and Dr. Maha Azzam, head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
If I can start with a quick fire question to you both before diving deep into our discussion. Should we be celebrating or mourning the Arab Spring 10 years on? John, what do you think? Should we be mourning or celebrating?
I think that there's both a kind of mourning and celebrating. We're obviously, it's still a mourning of what could have been. And I think, you know, when it occurred, many of us thought that the impossible had happened because we felt it would take many more years to see Mubarak leave and to see, you know, the others leave, Ben Ali, etc. But I think that if you really look at it, the fact is that, well, I think it was 4 years ago when I was asked a similar question. I said, well, I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. Well, there is a light in a certain kind of way. In the last couple of years, we've seen in a number of countries, in Sudan, a government has been overthrown. Admittedly, a military government is supposedly interim that's come in. We've seen popular protest in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Algeria. So the reality of it is that the example of the Arab Spring, the example in terms of the desire for democratization, and also the use of social media, etc., has shown that there are a body of people, very often driven more by youth, but also a cross-section of society, that when given an opportunity will come to the fore. Now, in the short term, they'll generally be repressed, as happened in Algeria and has happened in, you know, in a number of countries. But I think it does put on.
We could go. Yeah, we'll go deeper into a lot of these aspects in our 1 hour long conversation. Dr. Maha, what do you think? Should we be celebrating or mourning the Arab Spring? Just quickly. Oh, can you turn your speaker on, please? Sorry. You're on now, yeah.
We should be looking to see how we can move forward. It was an extremely important step in terms of confronting dictatorship and authoritarianism in the region. It's been a heavy price and a difficult route, and it's shown the fragility of the regimes on the one hand, and yet their ability to come back with all the vested interests that help them to come back, whether regional or international. It tells us it's a long struggle, but I think it was an important and crucial historical point that was a turning point in the history of the region. But it's not a failure insofar as it tells us very clearly that these regimes will not deliver, that we do need change in the region, and we need to see how to move forward.
Okay, let's dive right in and begin by looking at what sparked the popular revolt. It seems, you know, such a long time ago since the Tunisian fruit seller Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolated himself and lit the flame that started the revolt. Professor Esposito, what do you think were the main triggers for the uprising?
Well, I think if you look at Egypt's pro-democracy uprising, it was a popular revolution. It was a result of people. It's not a well-defined organization with a charismatic leader. Many of the activists and the demonstrators were young, well-educated, politically motivated, but it also included others within the society. I think that, you know, what sparked it was, you know, 30 years of living under authoritarian regimes. I remember a meeting with a young fellow very, very bright fellow who was in media at the time and had to leave the country, by the way, after it was crushed. But he showed me a picture of all the presidents of the United States next to Mubarak's name, all the presidents that Mubarak had dealt with. And that drove home for me, you know, that situation. And he said to me, he said, my age is 26. And the only person, only leader, the only government I've known is, you know, is this. And people had to accommodate themselves to that authoritarian government. But I think that it showed that that's what people really want. Major polling by Gallup just before it showed that that was what the Egyptian people wanted. And more recent polling, which I'll refer to later in the talk, shows that 74% of those people in the Arab world who were polled want democracy.
Yeah, we will get to the polling later on in the conversation. If I can refocus the same question to Dr. Maha, Azzam, two of the main slogans from the protests across the countries were bread, dignity, and social justice, and the other one, which was very famous, you know, Sha'ab yurid asqat al-nizam, the people want the downfall of the regime. Is there an argument to suggest that if the first aspiration was met, there wouldn't have been the need for the fall of a regime? You know, I ask this because it's become quite fashionable in the post-Arab Spring era to suggest that you can have bread, dignity, and social justice without a transition to a democracy and true political reform. Can you have one without the other? Is it possible to have bread, dignity, and social justice without political reform, a model of politics which is being pushed out at the moment?
Clearly, in the Arab world, that hasn't happened. Clearly, what we have is greater poverty. Let's look at Egypt, where, according to the World Bank, 60% of the population live under the poverty line. Let's look across North Africa and see the lack of development and corruption. What we have are elites in power. They've been in power for decades. We have a military in power in Egypt that has control of the economy like never before. It always had its hand over the economy. Now it has a stranglehold on the economy. The military leadership controls companies. It controls a huge percentage of the economy. We need to only not look at the words of the opposition, but look at the reports that have emanated from the Carnegie Institute, the writings of Yassid Sayer as to the control of the military of the economy. We have a very corrupt system throughout the Arab world. We have the wealth that we see among elites in the Gulf states and across North Africa, and only a trickle-down effect at best when the economy is going well to a fraction of the population. We're seeing increasing poverty. There is lack of development. The infrastructure of many of these states is crumbling. No, I think we need participation and accountability. We need accountability to say, where is the wealth going? What has happened over ultimately a century of authoritarianism and dictatorship since independence that has not delivered to the people. So yes, bread and social justice are one,
dignity,
and they are not going to happen with regimes that exploit their people and essentially, you know, steal from the wealth of the nation. That's what we face, I think, in the vast majority of the Arab world.
One quick point on this, you know, one needs to realize that for many of the governments we're looking at, they're basically the countries of family-owned countries. The governments see themselves as this is a family place, whether it's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, etc. And that prevents the kind of healthy society and freedoms. So, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE more and more talk and say that their form of stability, democracy can't bring stability.
We've got a lot of questions on Saudi Arabia and the UAE coming up. So let's just hold on to it. We've got lots of questions on that. I just want to remind the audience that this is a special 1 hour long show. I will be taking questions. So if you have a question you want to put to our guest, write it down, send a post on Facebook, and I'll try my best to pick it up. Just moving on, one of the puzzling things about the uprising was its surprise element. On a policy level, it's safe to say that it caught everyone off guard. But the question has always been, should that have been the case? It seems, politicians and policymakers in general ignored all the signs because it was convenient to do so. As you mentioned, Professor Esposito, you've done a lot of work on this. You have a book on Who Speaks for Islam, among several others, where you capture the mood within Arab states. 2010 Gallup poll before the Arab uprising showed that mass revolt was very likely. There were common grievances. GDP was going up, but it wasn't being shared amongst the population. At the same time, you had growing population that valued the principles of open society. So I ask you, should we have been surprised, and what does that surprise tell us about our understanding of the Middle East?
Well, in many ways, we shouldn't have been if we really understood the realities and paid attention to it. But in fact, the reason why most people were blindsided was that, first of all, the nature of governments themselves and their view of the world, and the fact that basically, Western powers went along with that. They went along with an idea that these were the countries, they may be authoritarian. It's the same thing we did at times with the Cold War or Latin America. We may not like that form of government, even though we say we're out to promote democracy and human rights. We may not like that form of government, but it provides stability in that country, and that protects our access to oil, the security of Israel. So all of that influenced what was going on. And when you, for example, if you look at professional associations, I was president of the Middle East Studies Association. In the early days, you never discussed democracy. It didn't come up as a viable topic. It wasn't even a topic to really debate. This was the conventional wisdom, that one sort of dealt with and that one accepted.
Yeah. Question about agency to Maha, political agency. Were the protesters fully organic? Did foreign interference play a role sparking the uprising? For example, there's so many US institutions working to promote democracy in parts of the Middle East. Or was this really the Arabs taking agency, taking control of their destiny for themselves? What would you say to that?
I think in the vast majority of cases, it was spontaneous, it was grassroots, and it involved organizations and parties that had for a very long time opposed dictatorship. Yes, there were possibly elements there that were encouraged by pro-democracy groups outside of the region that supported civil society organizations and promoted the idea of democracy. But it was a coming together of very many elements in society. But was it genuine? Was it part of the identity and yearning in the region for change and freedoms and rights? I would say definitely yes. I think the idea that it was motivated or moved by a small pro-democracy group on its own does not, in a sense, prove the reality of the situation once we also came to elections where they were allowed, where there were free and fair elections. In Tunisia and in Egypt, for example, people chose. It was difficult. Obviously, the old order was still at play. It had its influence and it had its interests and it has its means of coercing and so on. But at the end of the day, there was a margin of freedom that allowed people to make their choices. It is that margin of freedom that we need again. How you can force that on dictatorship that doesn't want a repeat of the Arab Spring is not easy.
Yeah, and turning our attention to the post-uprising, depressing aftermath of the uprising, what do you, Professor Esposito, explains the outcomes? Tunisia is a success story. Its transition to democracy was as peaceful as any revolution can be. On the other hand, On the other spectrum, we have Syria, which descended into civil war. That's as brutal as any civil war in history. And what were the reasons for such contrasting outcomes in your view?
Well, I think the differences in countries and the makeup of the countries, for example, if you look at Tunisia, it's a smaller country than in Syria and then Egypt, generally a well-educated population. The military did not intervene. You didn't have that same kind of deep state military intervention and continuing, attempting to control the society. Tunisia had a strong civil society organizations, strong trade union federation, human rights groups. On the other hand, you also had that Ennahda, the party that ran and won, was from the beginning one that indicated, even before the elections itself, that it wanted to build a coalition, that it would reach out to the secular parties if they lost. And Ennahda did that. And Ennahda, in a number of critical situations, even when they were, quote, in power, chose to emphasize national unity and democracy and to negotiate situations and even back out of the government at one point. That's a lot different than the situation that you see when you take a look at Syria. Syria, you've got a powerful and brutal regime, military willing to use any weapons available and to bomb and kill indiscriminately. You have a much more ethnically and religiously diverse population of Muslims, Christians, Sunni, Shia, etc. And you have the problem of multiple players that were involved. You have outside, jihadists coming in. You have the policy of Saudi Arabia that primarily was interested in getting some kind of Islamically oriented group in there and didn't really understand the group that it was getting in. And then you had the fact that the United States and the European Union and regional powers didn't really deliver on what initially they said they wanted, which was to get Assad out. In fact, they froze at a time when they should have been far more active and then backed off.
Yeah. Professor Esposito mentioned some of the reasons why Tunisia was successful and why Syria was descended into civil war. But Egypt in many ways is a unique case in that it went from a relatively peaceful transition to a very brutal and violent counter-revolution. Can you speak a bit about that and the level of suppression that was used by the key players and who was behind it? And also speak a little bit about what you say to the critics that argue that the June 2013 protest overturning the democratically elected government of the late President Mohamed Morsi represented the will of the Egyptian people as much as the January 2011 uprising, which saw the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak.
I think we need to go back to the results of 2012 and the results of the free and fair elections that brought to power President Mohamed Morsi, the late President Mohamed Morsi. Caused the regimes in the region to tremble, particularly in the Gulf, because they saw in that an equation between democracy, reform, and political Islam. And there were forces in the region that felt that they had to confront that and ensure that it wasn't going to be a success, whether in the Gulf, whether Israel, and I think it sent jitters throughout the ruling families of the region and also the ruling elite in Egypt, business interests and others that didn't want to have to face a drive against corruption. From very early on, after the late President Morsi came to power, they knew there would be an anti-corruption drive. They knew that the big businessman knew from October when he announced that taxes had to be paid by all. The level of wealth among an elite in Egypt is testimony to the huge difference between the haves and have-nots based on corruption. They had to upset that order. I remember I was in Egypt before the coup, when Dr. Morsi was still in power, around March, April, and being in the company of some of Egypt's elite who were opposed to Dr. Morsi. And what they said is, we've got to change this quickly. If we don't, if he lasts beyond the summer, we have a serious problem. And they discussed among themselves how they were holding out from investing, from making their factories work properly, and so on, in order to ensure the weakness of the economy. He was greatly challenged. He was challenged, and so was the choice. And I think this is important. It's not about Dr. Morsi, the late president. It's about the choice of the Egyptian people. They went out, stood in lines to vote freely for the first time in their lives. That choice was overturned by a collusion between the deep state, regional powers, and the outside world that also didn't like the choice and was beginning to feel very uncomfortable, because they knew that this regime may not play along all the way. This regime wanted reform. It wanted alliances with the outside world. The many trips that Dr. Morsi and others made to different parts of the world to reassure them that business could carry on. But the West did not want mutual respect and a new level of relationship. They preferred the old ways of doing things. There were security interests they worried about, although, again, the elected government ensured that the Camp David Accords would continue and Egypt would respect all its treaties, but that was not enough. I believe there was very serious interference from the Gulf states that financed the Tamarrud movement, the movement that started to collect signatures in order to raise and consolidate what was growing, obviously, frustration at the economic situation, growing frustration that the situation inside the country was not moving as quickly as they hoped. Obviously, it had been not even a year since the revolution, so the situation was not completely, in terms of the economy, moving forward as quickly as people wanted, but there was also various, and I don't want to make it seem a conspiracy theory, but you know, there were obstacles constantly to stop the electricity, to ensure that rubbish was not collected, and so on. The military and the security forces and their allies did their utmost to ensure the failure of this regime, of this elected government rather than regime. I believe that what happened in 2013 on the back of...
Can I just add something to that? Are we saying that there was a collusion to undermine the Islamist party in Egypt in a way that didn't exist in Tunisia? Could we say one of the reasons why An-Nahda flourished or succeeded in Tunisia is because there wasn't the level of collusion, and it wasn't as important as a country as maybe Egypt, and there was more at stake?
The level of collusion and determination that this experiment wouldn't succeed was greater, but I think the military's role and the security forces' role was key, because they could realize that and bring it about. But I do think that Egypt, in a sense, when we say the failure, they wanted to bring about the failure of an Islamist head of state, it was more than that. I wonder whether they wouldn't have wanted the fall of anyone who would have a democratically elected president, even a non-Islamist, that would really shake up the situation, the order of things, that wanted accountability, that would fight corruption and so on. I think the Islamist label gave them a greater excuse, but I think any democratically elected leader of Egypt would have sent jitters if his policies were going to be those about really fighting corruption, doing things a different way, and creating perhaps a different basis for regional and international alliances. And that was worrying. As far as the 30th of June is concerned, there were those that engaged in it, that were opposed, and they had every right to express their views. But this was, as many Egyptians say, a revolution of a number of hours. It was a photo shot that the military and the old state came out in force to ensure that there was some kind of, in quotes, legitimacy given to the military coup. And today, Egyptians who came out on the 30th of June and those who were opposed to it, but those who came out on the 30th of June and supported General Sisi are now regretting the military coup because they suffer under the iron fist policies of an authoritarian regime.
You mentioned the Gulf countries and the counter-revolution which they funded. There is, of course, a puzzling situation of why the Gulf countries were immune. Other than Bahrain, the wave of popular uprising did not reach the Arab kingdoms. Professor Esposito, what do the likes of the UAE, Saudi Arabia have in their authoritarian toolkit, which others don't?
Well, I think it's important to note that the Gulf states bankrolled the year before the government of Egypt was even overthrown. So they were very, very active. And after it spent billions of dollars on it. I think that in terms of the Gulf states themselves and their toolkit, A, they got the wealth. B, we see administrations such as, the American administration, that is Trump administration, we see Macron, we see the UK, all suddenly attracted to large contracts that have to do with business and sales. Indeed, President Trump made that a point when he went to Saudi Arabia, when he said, in effect, what we're concerned about is fighting terrorism, and we're concerned about big business contracts. We're not concerned about what countries do inside their country, meaning we're not concerned about human rights and democracy. And I think that attractiveness, enables, on the one hand, domestically, to see what is happening in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. There's a kind of liberal facade at times in terms of some decisions that are made, that women can drive cars, opening up in certain ways. But at the same time, over the years, they've become more and more authoritarian. Think about the number of prominent business people in Saudi Arabia who were detained, but never brought up on legal situations, on charges. Religious leaders, some of the women's rights leaders, one of whom has now been sentenced to prison. In that kind of situation, their toolkit is their ability to do what they want to do at home and to have Western powers not care.
Amazing toolkit to have. If I can focus a bit more on the contrast between Tunisia and Egypt, Dr. Maha. Tunisia, as we know, has been one bright light, and perhaps there's a lot of lesson to be learned from there. A key reason analysts say for their success is the fact that Islamists and secularists in Tunisia were able to make compromises. Why did their counterparts in Egypt fail so miserably to make compromises, which Tunisian Ennahda Party was able to do?
I think we need to be careful with this one, because this is a frequent refrain. In Tunisia, many of the compromises were also made in a different context, in a context where the military had not already carried out a coup. In Egypt, you had free and fair elections, and the people chose. Thereafter, there was the politics of trying to bring in different individuals from different, if you like, secular or liberal backgrounds into government, and some refused because they also did not necessarily want, they didn't see the situation as being stable. They may not have wanted to ally with the elected president. So there was the politics of all that. I think, a great deal of the politics of Islamist and liberal parties and secular parties working it out would have happened had the military not intervened. there would have been many ups and downs, and perhaps governments would have been established and cabinets fall and so on. But the democratic process could have got underway. It was very brutally interrupted by the military coup. So I actually hold that compromises could have been made, but ultimately the intervention of the military in such a brutal and violent way stopped the political process, however difficult it was going to be, from taking hold, and for different political parties to be able to negotiate politics in a democratic way, even though it may have been in a way that would have not been easy. In Tunisia, you didn't have that brutal interruption from the military. And yet we know that even in Tunisia, there are regional powers that have tried to play with members of parliament against the Nahda party. We know there's regional interference when possible, but the Tunisians, the difference is they stood by the vast majority and by the idea that they needed to protect their democracy. In Egypt, there was a factor which many Egyptians still feel very uneasy with, and that in the 30th of June, there were those that were willing to compromise their democracy and ally with the military in order to ensure the failure of the elected government.
One quick point. I was
going to ask you a direct question on this, Professor Esposito, regarding Nahda's evolution. There's always been this myth in the West that as soon as an Islamist takes power, they'll shut the door of democracy behind them. So what does Nahda's evolution since winning the elections tell us about opposition in general and also Islamist parties within the region?
Well, I think what it tells you is that, in fact, Islamist parties, depending on the Islamist party, obviously, in the country, are capable of adaptation. A lot depends on their realities. And it seems to me that, for example, one of the things that I always point out with regard to Ghannouchi was that the very weakness that some people would have seen when he was basically forced out of the country and lived overseas for 20 years, Ghannouchi had a lot of time to think about and observe what makes societies tick, what's necessary for democracy, etc. And so when he came home, as I said earlier, he was very proactive in announcing before the election itself that their candidate to be president was not going to be a member from Ennahda, and that he would reach out to all the other parties to bring them in. And throughout, he's been very consistent with regard to the importance of national unity and democracy. It's interesting that at one point when they were having a second big round of elections, there was a debate within Ennahda, and Ghannouchi traveled around the country trying to convince Ennahda people that they should allow those who had been on the other side to run for office. And there were those who said, no, there should be a time when they do not run for office. At the end of the day, Ghannouchi was right from the point of view of principle, I guess, but wrong from a political, point of view, because in fact, that then did lead to a significant change. But just one point I want to make with regard to when we compare it to the Egyptian situation, there never was a Morsi government. There was a Morsi presidency, never a Morsi government, because the military, security, the judges, all of those people were appointed by Mubarak and remained in power. So that's a major handicap when you talk about trying to establish. And in fact, there was a leader from the equivalent of the police in Egypt who was in a closed situation in DC and was asked about their role. This was during the Morsi period. And basically he said, we don't come out. In other words, we're not getting involved. We're not there to support. And you remember at one point when the presidency was surrounded, the police were nowhere to be seen. So I think that the contrast between a military that stays in the barracks and a military that remains, as well as other elements of the deep state that remained, as it were, in positions of power, they became very strong reasons for why you then saw what happened in Egypt and the contrast with Tunisia.
We're still looking back and trying to learn lessons from the past 10 years. So I want to ask you both this question. Is there a point or a moment you can look back to in the early phase and say, if things were done differently, it would not have turned out the way it did? So Maha, Dr. Azzam, you first.
I think to answer that question, one has to look at each country separately. I mean, if we look at Syria, the problem there was that you had regional powers become involved in international powers, whether Russia or Iran, and the situation took a very, very different turn. And you had armed groups and so on. If we look at Egypt, I think it's also a very different case. I think Egypt, what you had was an acceptance of the democratic process and a willingness to go down that path. That is why you have some revolutionary groups saying that the mistake that was made is that there was a willingness to try to reach a kind of a compromise at times, and then to go down the electoral path and to assume that that would be accepted, while really there should have been far more control over the different ministries. There should have been far more control and confrontation with the deep state. That would have involved a very different psyche and a very different political movement. What we had is parties playing by the rules of the game, of the democratic game, and in many ways they were facing the might of an authoritarian state and security forces. One thing we haven't mentioned, we mentioned the military a great deal, but the players that also ensured the failure of the democratic process and played along and were an arm of the military is, of course, the judiciary. And the media. So the military wasn't working on its own. It had all the elements of state power and societal and institutions that were helping it in its drive. They were the arms of, and remain so in Egypt today, the arms of oppression. So I think the choice was made. The choice was, let us go down the democratic path. And it's the choice I think the majority of the peoples of the region still want. They don't want disorder. They don't want instability. But at the same time, they want deep reform that will ultimately amount to revolutionary change. But they don't want the upheaval necessary of revolution, but is authoritarianism and brute force and repression and the massacres that we saw in different parts of the world, of the Arab world, whether in Syria or after the coup in Egypt with Rabaa, will these feed into the psyche of many of the young, if they don't see change over the next few years, to say there is no other route but it's going to have to be a zero-sum game. We don't want to go there. There is still belief in democracy and in the ballot box, but it can't be interrupted constantly by regional and international powers, because that will really lead to a complete, to systems that are already fragile, to breaking down and to even failed states across the region.
To you quickly, Professor Esposito, is there a moment you can turn to?
Right after the revolutions, we ran a conference in Turkey with a think tank there. And we had people, leadership from Egypt, from Syria, from Tunisia, etc. However different people were, there were two big concerns that they had. One was the deep state and what role it would play. And they kept bringing that up. They kept saying in previous revolutions, whether it was the US or France, etc., the deep state was either killed or imprisoned, etc. But what would happen in Tunisia? What would the deep state do? And what would happen in Egypt? Well, we know what the deep state did. But another concern they had was the West. And what really they kept asking me and several other people from the EU, etc., do we really think that the US and the EU will accept what's happened? And what did we see? The reality of it is, although initially there was an acceptance, remember the equivocation that occurred. In 1 week, you could have Obama say one thing and the Secretary of State say something else.
We're going to get to that, actually, yeah.
And that wound up, I think, being a factor. But there was also there a concern among some, particularly people who are professionals in terms of how organizations function, that among those, for example, within Egypt and or Tunisia, you had a lot of youth with no great experience and youth movements. And so they were concerned about, how would they fare in something like a deep state situation? The ability to have differences, but to realize and continue to focus on, the outside goal, as it were. And I think that did become an issue within Egypt, certainly, but also within Tunisia.
You mentioned the US's prevarications or lack of support for the Arab uprising, which is a good point for us to pull back our lenses and assess the global situation, the global response. The abiding logic, as you and our viewers will know, is the approach to the region has always been to support authoritarianism over democracy, thinking that somehow it will maintain stability in the region. A view many, yourself and us, would regard as deeply flawed, contradictory, and ultimately counterproductive. We saw this logic play out somewhat shamefully with President Obama, who cautiously supported the uprising in the beginning, but then he did nothing to protect the revolution in its infancy. His administration, for example, as you mentioned, was unwilling to call the 2013 coup a coup. So, Maha, should the US have done more, and could it have done more, not just in Egypt, but also in Syria?
Yeah, I think so. I think in Egypt, it definitely could have. My own sense is that while Obama initially opened up to the change, I think Hillary Clinton, was slower to make that kind of move, moving away from, again, the conventional relationship with authoritarian regimes and with the Mubarak government. And I think that what happened then is that in falling back, you then had this support situation, because remember, when Obama said a coup is a coup is a coup, what that allowed was the ability of Egypt to continue once relations were normalized, and it's actually occurred more recently with funding from the Trump administration for an annual $1.3 billion to go to the military. I think that's a big situation. I think the EU did a bit better before, that is in the early period, but really at the end of the day, they wound up within a short period of time accepting the legitimacy of these governments, and after a while dealing with them as if nothing had ever gone wrong.
Yeah, to you, Maha, and we saw that playing out recently as well. Is the West now in danger of making the same mistake by indulging autocratic counter-revolutionary forces? We saw recently President Macron, who went to Egypt and posed with Sisi, and Trump indulging the Gulf kingdoms, empowering them like never before. So would you say the West is now more convinced than ever that the need to preserve authoritarianism over democracy in the region is the most important thing? It's a pessimistic conclusion, but what do you think, Maha?
I think
just want to ask Dr. Maha on that.
I think what we've seen over the past few years, particularly during the Trump presidency, is just that. It is a bolstering of authoritarianism in the region, the belief that that is the safest card to play. And we've seen, as you've rightly said, democratic countries like France under Macron actually being, dare I say, bought by the president, the Egyptian general, through arms deals. Germany, France, Italy, even Britain here sell arms to Egypt. And to different levels. Perhaps Egypt, I believe, is in the category of the third country in the world, that the largest country that buys arms in the world, for a country where, as I've mentioned, 60% of its people live under the poverty line. One wonders why Egypt is arming at such a level. It's winning, it's improving its relations or ensuring that these countries from whom it buys arms are bound to it or bound to support the general. This is a very worrying state of affairs, because essentially Sisi has been able to ensure support through trade deals and arms purchases. Now, the United States, of course, plays a very important part in terms of the relationship with Egypt. We need to see what's going to happen under a Biden administration. There is hope that there will be greater pressure in terms particularly of the human rights abuses that are unprecedented in Egypt, and whether there can be some kind of pressure put on the dictatorship in Egypt. But in all honesty, decades have shown that the West, even if it gives a nod to attempts at political opening up or does not want human rights abuses to reach such a level that are embarrassing to even states, to the Europeans. We've seen how the European Parliament has also taken a harsher position, a stronger position vis-a-vis Sisi. At the end of the day, there needs to be a reappraisal of policy, a serious reappraisal that essentially by not just remaining silent, but by actively supporting these regimes, by actively doing business with them. They are ensuring the survival of these regimes and the continuing impoverishment of peoples across the region and the repression of these people. This is not a formula for stability. On the contrary, it is just not a formula for stability. So there needs to be political will. People might say one's dreaming, but I'm saying what's needed is political will among democracies to actually review policy towards countries and regimes in the region, and to say, are we actually backing the right horse? The problem is, what we've seen is so long as these autocrats can hold on to power, the West does not move. If the balance of power changes on the ground through protests or other, then they will shift ever so slightly and see what happens. And that's what we saw under President Obama. But that is not enough, because the peoples of the region have started to, from a long time back, actually, seen Western governments as complicit in the repression. And that is a very dangerous thing.
Did you want to say something quickly, Professor Esposito, before we move on to the next segment?
Just quickly? I think that, Trump and Macron, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, have focused on the business contracts and also fear of political Islam. And if you look at what Macron has done, Macron has given the Legion of Honor Award to Sisi. That's mindless, how that could even happen. The role that they play, as the US has played in assisting Saudi Arabia with regard to their war in Yemen, and his approach at home. Macron, if you look at Macron now, they use the phrase political Islam to come down on the broader Muslim community in France. When you look at the Trump administration, it's been completely uncritical in terms of its relationship with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. With regard to Saudi Arabia, I think it's a Khashoggi situation, and finally just quietly walking away. And the president even kind of trying to take credit for the fact that he kind of put that aside very quickly and very easily. And both countries have shared an attitude and approach when it has come to the Muslim Brotherhood, simply accepting what the Egyptians say. And so, for example, in the US, you've actually had congressional hearings with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood and whether it's a terrorist organization. I mean, this again is without, and those hearings very often not having experts that they usually would have from the State Department, the CIA, et cetera. So I think that this is very bad. Now, the good news is, I think, not completely good news. The Biden administration has already publicly committed itself in terms of its foreign policy to a return to including democracy and human rights. And I think that this is a concern now for countries like Saudi Arabia in terms of having to develop a new relationship as compared to the one that they had with Trump.
Yeah. Talking about the weapon sales, Dr. Azzam, I think Egypt is third. Saudi is number one as a percentage of GDP. Saudi is number one in the world. 11% of its GDP goes to purchasing weapons, and Middle Eastern countries, by and large, are in the top 10. You wonder what it's all for, and most of it's coming from the US and European countries. I want to swiftly move to the next segment, which is just look at some of the geopolitical changes that's happening in the Middle East and how the region has opened up to Russia and China. These two countries are anti-democratic forces, and they're playing a much greater role in the region than they did before. Do you think that their presence makes transition to democracy more difficult?
I mean, the case of Syria speaks, volumes. The Russian intervention there stifled peaceful, popular protests. That every time there is a lull, we see the urge once again for freedom and change, where we see small pockets by comparison of protesters. But of course, the role that Russia played has been to stifle any the fall of Assad, to ensure that there isn't a process towards democratization. And we can see how, again, Sisi flirts constantly with the Russians, whether through buying some Russian arms, through ensuring that he creates some kind of balance in case the West, particularly the United States, starts to put some kind of restrictions on him or pressure on him. So yes, we are seeing two major powers, and of course China, and with obviously its internal repression of in its own country, and of Muslims in particular. These are two countries that are very antagonistic both to democracy and to political Islam. So the challenge is very, very great. And we have dictators in the region that, so long as they have alliances with the United States, they're quite happy. But they are constantly cultivating relations with anyone who will support them, and whether through trade, business deals, security, and so on. And we're seeing relations improve with, in some quarters, with China and with Russia. And both these countries obviously want to have influence in the region. China has extended its influence enormously in Africa. So North Africa, Sudan, and Egypt are of great interest to it. We are facing serious challenges in terms of alliances with other authoritarian regimes, definitely, and they will bolster each other. And that is why it is so important that democracies realize that the alliances that should be made should be with the peoples of the region that want democracies, and that ultimately authoritarian regimes will stand together and will try to support one another. But it is nonsensical to be looking ahead to a more stable world with all the challenges that are going to be faced in terms of we faced the pandemic recently, we faced water shortages in Egypt, because of whether it's the dam, the Ethiopian dam, or whether because of global warming. We have so many environmental challenges coming up that will also, and poverty that will create instability. Do Western governments, democracies, want to actually aid and support the peoples of the region and see real development through and governments that aren't corrupt and can really try to deal with the pressing problems of development, or continue in their policies and just open the door to greater authoritarian influence coming also from Russia and China.
I know you want to say something on this, Professor Esposito, but I think because of short of time, if you can answer the next question, which is really to do with normalization with Israel. I mean, it's raised a number of questions with Israel being a militarily and technologically advanced country with decades of experience suppressing the political aspirations of a people. Are the region's autocrats looking to the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu for ways to add more arsenal to their authoritarian toolkit to stabilize their regimes? What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I think the normalization of the whole approach, and certainly the notion of the Abraham Accords, is doomed to failure. It's the product of, to begin with, it's a product of two individuals, or three: Trump, Netanyahu, and NBZ. Most of the countries that have signed on have done so from weakness and have something to gain from it. And I think that's forgotten. In terms of Sudan, for example, the U.S. will give a $1 billion bridge loan to the World Bank on behalf of Sudan, in addition to 1.1 billion in direct and indirect aid to the, so I mean, I think that with that reality, it is going to be doomed to failure. I think also, again, and I don't want to exaggerate because we can't totally be sure, but a Biden administration is not going to buy into the kind of agreements that have been worked through when it comes to these relations. And I think one of the challenges to the Biden administration is also going to be, what about Palestine? What about Palestine and Israel? So I don't see this really becoming robust, this accord. I think it will dissolve. I mean, it may in the short term remain robust between the UAE and Israel in terms of things that each of them can benefit from economically, or even in terms of a lot of Israel's expertise with spyware.
Mm-hmm. So quickly to Maha, we are running out of time on the issue of Gulf reconciliation between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And we noticed that the UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain were not present in this ceremony. MBS is also trying to lure multinationals to leave Dubai and relocate in Riyadh. Moreover, there's also deep disagreements between Saudi and the UAE in Yemen. Are we seeing a split? Could this be a beginning of a split within the counter-revolutionary forces in the Middle East?
I think the coming together of or the calming of the situation in the Gulf was expected. I think Egypt has its own dynamics and interests, but it can't be too far away from serving the line that both Saudi and the UAE want to take. It's reliant on them financially. It's reliant on them in terms of support for the Sisi himself on a personal level. So he will continue, Egypt will continue to play along. So the counter-revolutionary forces can't disagree too much, because in a sense they're all weak, as has been alluded to, and they ultimately will need to stick together. So in a sense, Israel is there as a counterpart to weak states that require support. They know that the revolution is still there, even though it is repressed, or upheaval against them is still there, even though it is suppressed. So they will stand together as much as possible. There won't be too much of an upset in the counter-revolutionary alliance, and they will continue to rely on Israel and Israel on them to ensure that they remain a block of sorts to counter any real change that will benefit the peoples of the region.
So just to finish up with another quick fire round, one sentence answer if possible. What next for the spirit and ethos of the Arab Spring? I mean, has it died, or will it find new ways to rise up? Starting with you, Professor Esposito, quick fire round.
Well, I think there's no doubt about the fact that in the short term, it will be stopped and repressed when it occurs. But I think in reality, I would expect that you'll continue to see political protests in the next 5 years, for example.
Azzam?
I think with each new generation and with the demographic changes happening throughout the Arab world, there is no alternative but change. And so there will be waves and demands for change. It may take longer than we would have hoped in 2010, 2011, but it's not going to go away. I think the peoples of the region deserve better, they want better, and they will achieve their freedom at some point.
With that, we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank my two distinguished guests for sharing their knowledge and thoughts in helping us to understand the Arab Spring and also where we go from here, a region that's given new meanings to terms like president for life, authoritarian stability, regime durability. But if history teaches anything about the illusions of safety and stability under the reign of tyranny, it is that if peaceful change is not possible, violent change becomes inevitable. Let's hope this lesson is learned sooner rather than later. I want to thank everyone for joining us and see you all soon. Bye-bye.